Hey everybody, and we are live again, and I am having issues again with sound, and it probably is how many people I have on here, but our workaround is I'm just going to speak very briefly, and then the panel is going to welcome everybody, and then Dan will go into his talk, and the panel will, the questions he might miss, they will bring them to his attention. So everybody, I think, probably knows Dan Hodnett, and he is with Dan's Fish, and also the owner, one of the owners, I guess, of Get Gills. And so we'll be seeing links throughout to those things. So I'd like to welcome Dan and also welcome our panel back, and find everybody's links in the description already. So Skipper, welcome back, and Chattanooga Ed, welcome back. Tennessee AQUA Bobby, welcome back, and let's get going. I'm going to mute myself so that hopefully that helps the situation.
All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Dan, your friendly fishmonger from dansfish.com. And today we're going to talk about one of the things I'm most passionate about because I think it needs a lot of help in our hobby, and that's shipping fish. Now, I'm going to do it a little bit different today, though, because I know a lot of you have already seen videos that I put out on how I ship fish. If you haven't, we just released another one this week. So if you look at, I think the most recent video we did, it's on shipping fish yet again. But the reason I hammer on that so hard so often is I feel like it's a section of our industry and our hobby that is just kind of woefully underrepresented. I think it's super important, and I don't think it gets the attention it deserves. And as a result, I think fish are suffering needlessly, and I think customers and friends that we're shipping fish to or exchanging fish with can end up having bad experiences. So I want to talk a little bit about the reasons behind kind of principles, I guess, general principles about shipping fish, not so much how I do it specifically, although I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about that. And if you have specific questions about how I do it, please ask. But I'm operating under the premise here that people kind of know my method a little bit already. Maybe you've watched a video or two about it. So I want to go in a little more depth, a different way from what you might have expected, just to make it interesting and worth your while. So the first thing is, let's talk about the history of aquarium fish a little bit in the West. So, you know, goldfish and koi and things, that's been going forever in different parts of the world. In ancient Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia, there's an M there. They used to keep fish, raise fish. So, you know, keeping and raising fish is something that's been done for thousands of years. However, something happened in 1850. There was a gentleman in Europe who brought in some paradise fish, the common ones that we have in the hobby now, and bred them and raised them. And that was a first, as far as we know, for Europe, for the Western world, if you will, to kind of start our hobby here in the West of fish raising. So since 1850, we've been breeding and raising fish. And as soon as that started, actually even before that started, we've been exchanging fish with each other. So the idea of shipping fish is not a new thing. It used to be that they were shipped on steamships in basically metal buckets, milk jugs, things like that, and on trains and all of that. And then more recently, we've kind of gotten to our modern way of doing it. And it's something that's been very important in our industry from a supply chain point of view, but also from a hobbyist point of view. So back when I started keeping and breeding fish in the early 1990s, there was something called the North American Fish Breeders Guild. And it was a monthly newsletter that was sent out to the members where people would list what they had available and what they wanted. And it wasn't like a buy-sell thing. It was a hobbyist exchange thing. So if you bred something and you saw that I wanted something that you had and you could see what I had, then we could get together and make an exchange. Say you had some kind of betta I wanted and I had some kind of guppy you wanted. Then we would call each other or mail each other even. It was pretty slow back then. There was no people didn't have email and internet and all that, but it was a way for us to exchange fish. And so for me, it started as a hobby thing, just trying to get a hold of species that I could not get at my local mom and pop, my local LFS. And I think that's the same for a lot of us. The American Killifish Association has had a monthly BNL. That organization was officially formed in 1962 and been sending killifish eggs and killifish themselves since then. So it's something that's been going on for a long time. And it's just a way for hobbyists to get fish that they normally can't get. And as you get deeper in the hobby and you see that strange fish that you're dreaming about, but it's not in the industry, and you have to find the other super nerd across the nation that has it and has happened to breed it, and you can make an exchange and get it, right? So that's why I think it's important. There's also an industry level, though, outside of the hobby, which has risen. So we had the mom and pop shops, and they reigned supreme for a long time. And then you saw in the 80s and 90s a shift happen where the big box stores moved in. A lot of the mom and pops, as we know, closed shop throughout the 90s and in the earlier part of this century. And so a lot of areas were left without a local fish store besides a big chain store. And as we all know, the big chain stores tend to carry just the bread and butter stuff. So they're great if you're just starting in the hobby. You can get some hardy stuff, some tetras, some barbs, maybe some live bearers, some assorted mabuna that hopefully don't contain an erotis or a bumblebee to get you started, things like that. But the moment you get actually interested and want to go beyond that, in a lot of places in the United States, you're curtailed because the mom and pop shops largely have been forced out of business. And if all you have around you is a big box store, it's going to be tough for you to get as deep in the hobby as you want. So I'm really excited when I drive through a new city and I see a mom and pop. I always get on my phone and search for mom and pops, because the ones that are still around, or the ones that are the LFS that are kind of starting to rise again, now that we've seen the limitations of the big box, I love stopping and seeing them. But for a lot of the United States, that's not an option. Or even they can't get a hold of the fish. If you're into that rare rainbow fish or that rare killifish or that wild type betta or whatever, right? So the only way really to get a lot of the fish we want is to ship them, often from other hobbyists. And AQUA did a big service for this, as we know. Back in the 90s, Mark launched AQUA, and that kind of made it really easy to get in touch and see what other people had, and shipping took off even more. People could make a little side money on that. If they didn't have an LFS they could sell their excess fish to, suddenly they had a national market, even a worldwide market. So it went kind of from people you knew to clubs like the ALA and the AKA, and then it kind of moved online. And so ever since then, it's exploded. So that's kind of the background, I guess, just really in brief, of shipping and its importance to us, a little bit as an industry, but also as a hobby. So if we're going to be shipping, there's something we need to be aware of. And that is that the places we ship with, UPS, FedEx, USPS, have regulations and rules. And we kind of need to be aware of them before we ship. I think a lot of us aren't aware of them. But a couple things. The fish have to be double bagged. That's just a regulation with all three carriers. You need absorbent material in the box so that if a bag leaked, it could be absorbed, right? And you need some kind of cushioned liner around it as well. These are all regulations that the three major carriers have. And there's been a lot of times when I've received fish and they're just in a plain cardboard box, or even in like a padded envelope, believe it or not. And the regulations haven't been followed. So the first thing I want to encourage us to do is get to know the regulations of whichever carrier you use when you ship fish. Or if you want to ship fish, get to know all three and see which of the regulations you can most easily follow. And maybe that helps you determine which carrier to use. FedEx, for example, you have to actually become a known shipper. You have to kind of pass a test. You have to send them a package, and they have to analyze your packaging before you can legally, before you're actually supposed to ship with FedEx, right? So there's all these things that we should be aware of that I don't think we are. So kind of want to just get the wheels turning on that. And one of the reasons I think that's important is because every transaction where we put fish in a carrier's hands is much bigger than just the transaction between you and whoever you're sending the fish to. We have to take the carrier into consideration. So if you're UPS or FedEx or USPS and you get all these packages that are not packed according to your regulations, that's probably going to upset you. And you might think twice about allowing people to ship live fish. And we don't want to get in a situation where we're doing such a bad job shipping fish and ignoring the regulations so that the carriers are like, you know what, we just aren't going to allow anyone to ship fish. Because think of all the fish that you couldn't get a hold of if you couldn't get them from another hobbyist across the United States. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. And I often think that all we think about is us and whoever we're sending them to, without realizing there's this whole integral part in between, who is the carrier, that is also part of this process and that needs to be okay with how we're doing it. So get to know those regulations and let's adhere to them. Let's not ship fish sloppily so that they leak and damage all the packages around them, and the carriers are like, you know, this keeps happening, we got to stop this. So that's kind of the mindset I think we need to have, more than just, I'm going to send them to Bob, so this is between me and Bob. No, this is between me, the carrier, and Bob. Okay. So getting that out of the way, I want to talk about some other things that I think are important. One more big picture thing before we go into kind of the nuts and bolts of shipping a little bit and the principles to follow to have success shipping fish. One other thing is just how our society's views of animals have changed over the last several decades. When the tropical fish industry was kind of set up and booming, you know, the 50s, war was over. There's a bunch of fish farms in Florida. There's mom and pop shops everywhere, and there's 5 and dime stores everywhere carrying fish. And it's a big thing, right? And so this industry was set up according to the norms and values and the way we see animals, and in this case, fish, you know, back then. And what's happened is society's attitudes towards animals, and in this case, fish, have changed over the decades, but our practices, our industry hasn't. And this is a problem. And trust me, I'm not trying to get into a political thing here or some kind of animal rights thing here, any of that. But what we need to be aware of on a practical, just as a practical matter, is if we don't adjust and care for fish, and a big part of this is fish transport, fish shipping, in a way that people living today see as humane or ethical. In other words, if we still are shipping fish according to the ethics of the 1950s, then we're going to make a lot of people upset. And when people get upset, they tend to talk to their political leaders. And when their political leaders hear enough noise, they regulate. So one of the things I think we need to do is, as hobbyists and as an industry, is take a look and say, okay, people care about fish and other animals more, let's say, than they used to in the 50s, or they see them differently, might be a more fair way to put it, right? They're more concerned about the welfare of the animals in general as a society. And there's different ethics and feelings about how live animals need to be treated and handled. What are those? And how can we make it so that we do such a damn good job shipping fish that we don't get regulated, that people aren't so upset and there isn't so much noise that the politicians decide this is an issue they have to tackle. So that's another big picture thing I think we need to think about. Every time you send out a box of fish, it has the potential of sending a good message to the world around you or a bad message to the world around you. If we send good messages, we're much less likely to find ourselves in a situation where, shoot, we got regulated, we're shut down, we can no longer ship fish. Or, oh, we have a white list, we can only keep guppies and goldfish now, or any of those other things. So I just think that it's important to see a bigger picture when we're sending fish. It's not just you and whoever's receiving them, it's you and the carrier and whoever's receiving them, but it's also the entire world that is watching. There are folks that are very concerned about these things and will report every infraction. And we need to do things in such a way that they have very little to report because we're doing such a good job. Now, it's also just the right thing to do, right? If we are in this hobby, I imagine we actually like fish and like animals and want to respect them and treat them well. So that's kind of some big picture things. I know it's a little high horse. I get that. I'm not trying to be political. I'm just trying to be practical and say what could shut me down completely as a fish business? What could shut down the industry I love? What could make it so that I am no longer to get the fish in that brings such joy to my life? Like I seriously can't imagine what I would do with my time if I didn't have fish. Like if it was just regulated out, okay, you can't keep fish anymore, or you can't transport them anymore, or you can, but it's only these 10 species, right? My life would be much, much less enjoyable. So that's the kind of view I think we should take when we're keeping fish, obtaining fish, shipping fish. There are no secrets anymore. So one reason this is changing is it used to be that, especially on the industry side, that you could do things in a pretty horrible way and get away with it and no one would know because the internet was not there or it wasn't at scale yet. But the truth is there are no secrets anymore. Everyone knows what everyone's doing. All the curtains that were obscuring any part of the industry or the supply chain or how things are done are all being lifted because everyone has a phone with a camera and is able to show stuff, right? So we need to show the world that we're doing this in a responsible, ethical, and way, and also that, I mean, and why wouldn't we, right? We love these animals, I would assume. So anyway, enough kind of that kind of like, I hope that wasn't political. I don't mean it to be, but that kind of thing. Let's talk about the nuts and bolts. Let's talk about the principles of shipping fish successfully, because I do it a very specific way. I'm assuming most of you know how I do it, but I don't think that's the only way. I think as long as the basic principles are followed, you can come up with the way that works for you. I mean, why not? There's many ways to, speaking of unethical, to skin a cat, as my grandpa would say. So let's start with water prep. So something that is important that I think might not be common knowledge is the kind of water you use. Typically, what I think we do is we scoop some water out of our aquarium, put it in the bag, put the fish in, and ship the fish. The issue is that water in your aquarium is biologically active, and it needs certain amount of flow, a certain amount of care that the aquarium provides in order for all the little organisms and such in that water to stay alive. When you put them in a little bag and ship them, those systems aren't in effect necessarily, and you could have a die-off. So you might not even see it, but you can have a lot of organic matter, a bunch of live organisms in that water that will die off shortly after you put it in the bag because now it doesn't have the flow it needed to sustain it or what have you, right? So we don't want to put biologically active water in our bags when we're shipping fish. The other thing is that water contains trace amounts of ammonia, trace amounts of nitrite, but it's going to have nitrate, and it's going to have other things in it that are stressful to fish just because it's coming from a biologically active system. We really don't want that. So the best thing to do is get nice, clean water that has never had fish in it, but is stabilized. So if you go to your tap and you get some water and you fill up your container that you're going to use to ship fish, and you try to ship the fish right away, you're going to have a problem because the water in your tap is not stable. Your municipality has probably altered the pH because it doesn't want acid eating the pipes, so it made it more basic. Or if you have really hard alkaline water, it made it a little less alkaline because it's hoping that it won't get clogged with all the calcium carbonate and stuff, right? So they've tried to take that down a little bit. But these are all temporary fixes. These are all things that are done temporarily for the good of the pipes in your city, okay, to make them easier to maintain. Also, as we know, there's chlorine and things like that. And the water in those pipes is under pressure, and there's all kinds of effects that happen when things are under pressure, all kinds of gases that get dissolved in the water and such. Nitrogen's a big one. Kind of like when you go deep sea diving, right, and you get the bends. That's just because nitrogen is under enough pressure at that depth that it absorbs, that it turns into a gas, basically. It absorbs into your bloodstream, and then when the pressure is released, turns into a gas. So what we want to do is stabilize that water. So we take that water and we give it, let's say, 12 hours before it comes out of the tap, before it goes into the bag. And we put it in a container, we turn on an air stone, and we let it bubble. That's going to release all the gases, churn everything, keep it well oxygenated, give the water time to stabilize so that it's kind of in its final state before it goes in the bag and before the fish goes into it. If we don't do that, we're going to put the fish in a bag with water that is rapidly changing. And as we know, fish like stability. If they're put in parameters that are just rapidly changing, it's very stressful to them, and it can be fatal. And also, all those little micro bubbles that coat the inside of your glass when you get water from the tap, that's all dissolved gas that has been released from the pressure of the pipe and is now turning back into a gas and trying to find its way out. That's all very unstable. So we want to give it time to do that. So prep your water carefully. Give yourself plenty of time, 12 to 24 hours. Let an air stone bubble it, let it gas off, let it come to temperature. Then it's stable. Then it's better for your fish. The other thing you want to do, at least I want to do, is make the trip as least stressful as possible for the fish. We all know that when we ship fish, that's a stressful time. And when fish go under stress, they can succumb to disease. That's when we often see ick, right? Shortly after we introduce a new fish, because it's just been through kind of this stressful period. And therefore its immune system, due to stress, has been compromised. Now, we all have this, where in stressful conditions, our body shuts down things that aren't essential to that moment. If we're kind of in a fight or flight situation, our immune system's compromised, our reproductive drive is compromised, our digestion even is compromised, because we just need to be ready to run or fight at that moment. That's what the fish is doing when it's in a stressful situation. So with the compromised immune system and even a digestive system which isn't metabolizing things as readily as it could, we need to take as much stress off the animal as we can. And I think salt's a good way to do that. The reason is fish use a good percentage of their energy just to maintain osmotic homeostasis. So fish are salty creatures, right? They come from the ocean just like the rest of us pretty much. And their blood is about the same salinity as salt water, just like you and I. But they're freshwater. We're talking about freshwater fish here. So all that fresh water is trying to invade their cells, trying to invade their body because of osmotic pressure. You have a lot more salt in the fish, a lot less outside of the fish, and so osmotic pressure wants to make that regulated, make that equalized. We can help the fish by adding salt to the water. I use 5 grams per liter. That makes it so that there is some salt outside of the fish as well as inside of the fish. So there's a lot less of that pressure of the water just trying to get into the fish, trying to invade the cells. If you've ever seen a fish that is totally bloated out, dropsy, for instance, pine coned out, that's a failure often of osmotic regulation, where the fish can no longer keep the excess water out of its body, and we just see that big bloat that happens, right? Okay, so if we put some salt in the water, then the fish doesn't have to work nearly as hard to keep that water out of its body. And that energy that it saves, it can put towards things like keeping its immune system going, or absorbing nutrients that it needs to stay healthy, or other things like that. Now, we're not feeding the fish, but it still has fat reserves it can draw on. It still is utilizing nutrients in some way, right? So just 2 little things that I think we overlook a lot is keep that water as clean and stable as you can. And let's try to free up as much of that fish's battery, if you will, as possible by using a little salt. And yes, I use it on loaches, I use it on cories, I use it on plecos, I use it on all those fish that you've been told are sensitive to salt. And it's actually not a problem. I have it from very good sources that 5 to 8 grams per liter of salt isn't harmful to any fish that we know of so far. Had some aquatic veterinarians who've told me that. So that's just some basics. I have about 4 more minutes before we get into the questions and comments, I think. So let's see here. I think the last thing we'll talk about is fish prep. I think most of us know this, so this will just be brief. But basically, you don't want to put a fish in a bag and have it poop all over. You're going to create all kinds of ammonia and all kinds of toxins in the bag that will add stress to the fish and could kill it, right? So I think we all know this, but we need to fast the fish. And, fasting just means don't feed the fish for a day or so before we put it in the bag to be shipped. Now, that doesn't always mean just that we don't feed the fish. That's part of it. But there's plenty of fish that even if we don't feed them, they're going to eat. So plecos, you stop feeding, they're still going to scrape algae and stuff and find something to eat. Barbs are horrible at this. You stop feeding barbs, they don't care. They'll just eat detritus. They'll find something to eat, right? So to truly fast a fish, often we need to put it in an environment where there isn't all that stuff, whether it's the shipping bag itself or whether it's a small container that you hang on the tank that doesn't have algae growing in it or detritus and things like that. So that when you put the fish in the bag, its intestines truly are empty or mostly empty. So the way I do that is I catch the fish, I put it in the bag a day early because there's nothing in the bag for it to eat. Then I change the water in the bag before I seal the fish up and send it out. So that works for me. But you could get a breeding trap if you have one of those. Put that on a breeding net. Heck, even a big net itself. There's lots of things you can do to isolate the fish, not just from food, but from all the grunge in the environment that it might ingest. Just so that you don't have a big, poop bomb, which means ammonia bomb in the water. Do be aware that that's not the only source of ammonia when you're shipping. Fish also excrete ammonia through their gills. That's one reason why levels of ammonia in water are so damaging to fish. It's because when there's ammonia outside the fish in the environment, then the passive excretion of ammonia through the gills is hampered, again, due to osmotic pressure. So the fish has a hard time getting rid of the ammonia and it starts building up in the fish's body. So the gills have a lot to do with the fish's metabolism and the excretion of toxins and things like that. It's not just poop, but poop's what we can control. So that's what we do. To kind of help with the stuff that we can't control, like the gills or the little bit of poop that's going to happen because we thought we got it all, but we didn't. It's a pleco. It's going to poop for days, right? We do our best, but there's going to be a little residual poop in the fish. I like to use something that detoxifies ammonia and nitrite. I like Seachem Safe just because a little bit goes forever, but you can use Seachem Prime. You can use any of the other, products that do that. I don't have experience with much besides Seachem Safe and Seachem Prime. That's what I found works for me. But just another principle, basically, how do we keep the water clean around the fish? And how do we keep any toxins from becoming, because they're going to be there. We can't prevent it completely, but how do we mitigate that as much as possible? So there's more I can talk about. There's a lot more details, but those are some basic principles that I think are good to cover. And that big picture stuff is just stuff that we don't hear, probably because it feels a little political, even though I don't mean it to be. But I think let's start thinking big picture when we ship fish. Let's not just think, I'm sending fish to Bob. If he's happy, it's all good. Or if something goes wrong, it's just Bob. He loves me. He'll forgive me. No, the whole world's watching. Let's conduct ourselves in such a way that they have nothing to complain about. So with that, I think we're at questions and comments. Is that right?
Yes. So I'm still crackly, I assume.
A little bit.
Okay, so I'm going to keep myself muted unless I need to say something. So I'm going to let you guys ask questions, panel. And if there are questions in the chat, bring those to Dan's attention if he doesn't see them. So,
Yeah, I literally didn't look at the chat at all there. I was trying to look at the camera, so I missed everything. So
Well, Dan, how long have you been shipping fish?
since I was a wee tyke. So I got into fish keeping early 90s, and I almost immediately started shipping fish because I liked killifish. I saw pictures in a book in my local library, because as soon as I got into fish, I went to the local library and read everything they had several times. And there were pictures of like Nothobronchius gunthri, Nothobronchius rackevi, Fundulopanchax gardneri, just what was called Cynolebius nigripinus at the time, the South American pearl killifish. And I just thought they were the prettiest thing I ever had encountered. I didn't know that freshwater fish could be that pretty. In fact, when I first saw the pictures, I was like, why are they showing me saltwater fish? And the thing is with killies is the only way to get them pretty much back then, and still in a lot of ways, was to be a member of the American Killifish Association and to get them from other killie geeks, because they were not in the industry in any meaningful kind of way. And so I got in the summer between 6th and 7th grade is when I started keeping fish. And within a few months, I was shipping fish and receiving fish from other people. So I was just a kid in 7th grade. But it came out of necessity. Like, it's not something I ever thought I would do. But I wanted that fish. To get it, I had to trade something. And I didn't have any money. I was a kid. And that's how it happened.
Now, Dan, if you had to pick of what you have now, what fish would you say is your favorite?
Well, so I actually get asked this a lot. So the answer might seem unimaginative, but it's Fundulopanchax gardneri. It's a beautiful killifish. It's the first egg layer that I ever remember spawning and raising successfully. And it took me several months to track down my first killifish, and those were the first ones that I got. So they just have a near and dear place in my heart. They're beautiful, they're hardy, they're peaceful enough you can keep them in a community tank. They aren't super shy, so they come out, you see them, and they're easy to breed and raise. And so for me, they're just a fun fish. Now, it's not a fish that I find particularly challenging or anything like that. So it's not like I would only want to ever have to keep them. I like a challenge. I like to crack new codes of breeding and keeping different things. But if I had to pick one fish, it would be that. And it's just for nostalgia. It's because when I was a kid, that's how it happened.
Dan, you have
Thank
a
you.
question from Aqua Balls.
Aqua
He wants
Balls!
to know, is there a bet? Or wait, do you use oxygen when shipping your fish? And should you tell your customers is a special way to acclimate them?
Yeah, so here is my big ugly green cylinder of oxygen right there. So I do that. But the first couple decades shipping fish, I didn't use oxygen. I just used atmosphere. I would just do that trick where you grab the top of the bag real quick and twist it, right? And that's fine. There is a lot of oxygen, as far as a fish is concerned, in the atmosphere that can be absorbed into the water. Fish are so efficient at removing oxygen from water, it's unreal. So I don't think you have to use pure oxygen. It's insurance, though. If something were to go wrong, if the fish were lost in the mail, and this has happened to me where fish have been lost in the mail literally for weeks, and you think, oh, that's never, they're done. And then they were returned to me, or they finally made it to the customer in some instances, and the fish were still alive. And it's like, whoa. Now, not always. Those are the happy endings. That's not always how it ends. But I think that in cases where something goes wrong, having pure oxygen, if you will, like 99.8, whatever it is, purity, helps mitigate disaster. So that's another thing, actually, that's probably important to say. I pack the fish to last, say, a week or so. I pack the fish now just like I used to pack them when I shipped USPS Priority, which was, they would say 2 day, but usually 3, often 4 days in the mail, right? So even though the fish are being shipped next day now, still, you want to pack them in case something goes wrong. And every now and then it does. And sometimes it goes wrong big time. Like I've had entire shipments that were stuck in Colorado because there was a snowstorm, or stuck in Memphis because there was a flood, or whatever. You know, you can't predict everything. Or there was a power outage once because of, I can't remember why, high winds or something. But every now and then something will happen that just grinds the entire system to a halt, and it's nothing you can predict or have any control over. So I think it's important to pack for the long haul. Like, let's pack for 3 days, even though it's just going to be 1 day, hopefully, or even just a night in transit. So oxygen helps with that.
Oh, we've got another question from Bob. He wants to know, what fish does Dan think has the most has been his most difficult to ship? We had black piranhas that we had to ship to show. Wait, we had to ship. Oh, we had to ship to show in the metal tannin.
That question's actually from Chewy. He just addressed it to me. Yeah.
Okay. And I probably should try to read with my glasses.
There's no shame, brother. I'm with you. 4 eyes is better than 2, I say. So Chewy or Lunatic Fringe, they used to transfer me these metal tins, kind of like what you'd milk a cow in, basically, back in the day. And they'd put them on the train and send them across the country, right? Or in the boat and bring them overseas. That's kind of how it was done. I can see how piranha would be difficult just because their teeth. A lot of the large plecos are really difficult. Same thing. They can just poke through a bag super easy. Some of your larger puffers are that way. I tend to not deal with that kind of stuff. I tend to deal with, small, peaceful stuff that I can put in a bag and send. So for me, it's more fish that come from really pure, fast-flowing rivers with high oxygen content, and often cooler temperatures. So if it's just beating down heat in the summer, then a lot of the fish that like cooler temperatures are going to be really difficult. Yeah, you can put an ice pack in and everything, and that's helpful. But a lot of the fish that like cooler temperatures have really high oxygen demand, because as water temperature rises, its ability to absorb oxygen decreases in relation to the temperature. So fish that come from cooler temperatures, and I'm not talking like 40 degrees like a trout. I'm just talking like, that prefer 68 degrees or 72 degrees to 80 degrees, let's say. They have a higher oxygen demand. So keeping oxygen high enough, even though I just talked about oxygen is not that big a deal, right? I understand the irony of what I'm doing here, but those fish, the water has to be really clean, because if it's not, or if it gets too hot, the oxygen drops and you can have issues. So like hill trouts, really high energy fish that needs a lot of oxygen. It's basically comes from a riffle, just super saturated part of the stream, super saturated with oxygen. Another one that's you have to be careful with are some of the Tanganyikan cichlids, the more midwater swimmers. Those can be a little difficult. Lamprichthes tanganyikanus, the Tanganyikan lampi, those can be a little difficult. So it's nothing it's basically about oxygen demand. So something else that happens is if your water is dirty, that sucks oxygen away from the fish being able to use it, right? If another reason to not use water from your tank is all those little microorganisms, if they don't die off and cause ammonia problems, they do use a lot of oxygen, and they'll deprive the fish of access to it. So I think that's my answer. Anything that has a really high oxygen demand compared to most other fish.
I was incredibly impressed when you sent me the dragon puffer.
Oh,
That those bags were so thick and large. I didn't know. I was impressed that you had those on hand, or maybe did you have to order those special, or
I
are you
use
just
much.
prepared?
Yeah, I use much thicker bags than your average Joe. No offense, anyone named Joe. Joe Coffee. No offense. I don't like a flimsy 1 or 2 mil bag, and a 2 mil bag's kind of industry standard. I just don't like trusting that to a fish. So I typically use at least a 4 mil. And with the dragon puffers, I think I put 4 of them together. So we were looking at 16 mil, which is thick. I just didn't want those things accidentally poking a hole, because they've got a beak that they could have done that pretty easily. And I did a couple things different with those. I laid them on their side so that more surface area was there for more oxygen absorption into the water. Those are one you don't have to feed all that often because they're a sit and wait predator. So I was able to fast them a few days extra. I like a 4 mil bag.
Well, it was very impressive. It felt like I was cutting through a tent or something.
Yeah. Yep. Hopefully, if it's hard for you, it's hard for the puffer to get through too.
Well, she made it great, so that was awesome.
So Priscilla wants to know when you're going to be going back down to her place, because she turned her fish room into a shrimp room.
Yeah, I've been wanting to see that, Priscilla, for a while. I was thinking of you, Priscilla, recently. First, because of the shooting. I know you have the store Priscilla works at is in Boulder, Colorado. And so that community is reeling right now. And before that, because of that massive snowstorm that I know you went through. So I've actually had you on my mind a bit, lady. I hope you're doing well. And so I'm still working on Nigeria, trying to get those fish. I talked to that supplier yesterday, and we're trying to get them into Denver. So if that shipment comes through Denver, I'll be going down for that. And depending on the timing, I do hope to have the time to come over and see your fish room, or your shrimp room, I should say. Hope you're doing well, though. Your neck of the woods has been kind of hammered lately, so I do think of you, and I send you good wishes, Priscilla. Hope you're doing good.
Well, Dan, we know that you're still growing there, but let's say it just blows up and does super great, and you're ready to do a second location. Where would you put your second location?
It would be Memphis, Tennessee, or Louisville, Kentucky, probably. I'd have to look into it a little more, but that's probably where, if we ever moved, I don't think we'd ever have separate locations, but if we ever decided for logistics reasons to move, those areas would make sense. That's where the UPS hub is and the FedEx hub is. I don't know about regulations. I don't know how easy it is to do business in those states and all that, but just from a pure shipping cost standpoint and less time in transit standpoint, those two areas make sense because that's where the major shipping providers are. And I've actually thought about this. I thought about Memphis, Tennessee, and Louisville, Kentucky, or thereabouts for this warehouse as well when I was first thinking about it. The reason I stuck with Wyoming is, first of all, the water is amazing here. So it's so good for fish. But the other thing is Wyoming's, like, time after time, if you look at national studies, rated the number one state to do business with, just because the taxes are so low. So there's very little overhead. Being a guy, I came from California, and I just know if I did this in California, all the fees and everything I'd have to pay would make it very difficult to do what I'm doing. So if we ever did move anywhere, it would be for shipping purposes, probably, just to be closer to a center of distribution. And the business climate would have to make sense as well. So there'd be a lot to consider. I don't have any plans to do that. I'm putting down roots here, but I did think about it earlier when I was thinking where would be the best place to put roots. So, yeah.
Well, with 3 guys here from Tennessee, we approve that, except you're on the
Tennessee
wrong side of the
Mafia.
state.
Absolutely. I mean,
That's
like,
right.
as soon as he said Memphis, Tennessee, I was like, hey, that'll be nice because I can drive there.
It's a day trip.
Dan, Eric Furlow says, what's the most difficult fish you have ever shipped? I would add to that, and why?
Let's see here. The one that had me the most nervous was let me look it up here so I can make sure the fish's name hasn't changed. Oh, I'm so used to like pulling stuff up and sharing it with people, and I can't do that now. So I was gonna bring it up and show you guys a picture, but it's Paracyprochromis nigripinus, which is a Tanganyikan cichlid that just has I didn't have problems shipping them, but it has a reputation for being just nigh unshippable. And so those had me the most nervous until I'd done it a few times and had success. But by then I was far enough in my shipping journey that I was doing 1 fish per bag, and I was giving a lot of space and oxygen per fish and things like that, especially those. So I put them in like a bag that was 3 times bigger than I'd put in a fish normally at their size and things like that. So those are the ones that had me the most nervous. What I found is usually, since I don't deal with anything with a lot of teeth or spines that can just tear through a bag, so that problem I don't usually have to deal with. So what I found is almost everything else, if you can keep the temperature decent in the box, it'll do fine if it's been well acclimated. Like Kubatai rasboras, for example, have a reputation for being really difficult to ship. But they're not. What they are is difficult to acclimate and stabilize post-importation. But if you take the time to do that and get them to the point where they're not shaky anymore, is what I call it, after they've been imported, and they're eating and they've gained weight back and they're ready to go, then even those Microdevario kubatai, or neon green rasbora sometimes they're called, even those aren't a problem. So I think there are some species that you want to take a little extra care for, and have some special needs shipping wise. But mainly it's about preparation. Mainly it's about making sure that the fish have had the time they need to acclimate and settle and get used to, like, and fully recover from being imported or transported or whatever before you ship them off to a customer. If you do that, I don't think there's many fish that would be difficult to ship that we keep in aquariums anyway.
Chewy from Lunatic Fringe asked, what killifish would you consider the hardest to ship? He's heard that the killifish in Lake, I think he's saying Tanganyikan, is very difficult to ship.
That's the one that I would have said. In fact, I think I did a little earlier. Yeah, it's called Lamprichthyes tanganyikanus. It's a part of the reason why is it's almost like a rainbow fish. It's big. It can get 6 inches or so, 5, 6 inches. Actually, I think it can get, I'd have to double check myself on this, but I want to say it might get up to like 9 inches or so, but call it a 6-inch fish, right? And it's super active. It's super fast. So it's like a giant danio or something activity level, or a rainbow fish activity level, like a chilotharina or something like that. And so high activity, needs really clean water, doesn't like acidic water. And sometimes when you put a fish in a bag, and because it's respirating and releasing carbon dioxide, you get carbonic acid absorbing into the water. And so if that goes on long enough, that can be really hard on a alkaline loving fish like Lamprichthyes tanganyikanus. I think it's called the Lake Tanganyika killifish or Tanganyikan lampi. There's all kinds of different common names for it. But the combination of size, activity level, and the need for clean water make that a difficult fish, at least by reputation. I like to ship them when they're about an inch or inch and a half long. It makes it a lot easier. Most killifish, about as hardy as they get. Killifish are one of the easiest fish to ship, but that's an exception. There are a few exceptions.
Dan, there's lots of discussion in the chat about the gold roseline barbs, and people still wanting to get those and can't find them anywhere but when you have them and so forth. So,
is that the gold rose lines?
yes.
Yeah, so it's a simple supply and demand thing. I literally bought the breeder out of all the ones they had that were that size. I could have got some that were 4 or 5 inches, like full adults, but the price on that would have been crazy. So that's a very expensive fish at that size. But all the ones that were at a size that made sense, I bought them out. So anytime I can, I buy them. The secret with that fish is, oh, I don't know if it's a secret, but the truth about that fish at an industry level is it's not being produced in large numbers. So there'll be lots of suppliers, resellers, transshippers, importers, things like that, wholesalers that will have them on their lists, but they never actually have them in stock. I've been shorted on that fish dozens of times. The only way I've been able to get it is to actually buy them from the guy that actually breeds them, the guy that invented, if you will, that fish, created the gold form of the Denison barb in Indonesia. He's the most reliable. And when he says he has them, he does, but not in large numbers. So every time he has them, I buy them. I think I tried to order 80 of them, 60 or 80 of them this time. I was lucky to get, what did I get? 10, 20, something like that. So it's a supply and demand thing.
Ricky at RB Animals and Collectible wants to know what size sponge filter you recommend for a 20-gallon tall.
I always go overkill on sponge filters. So even in my 20 gallons that I have the big boy. It's about 5 inches around. And I like a chorus sponge filter too. It doesn't clog as easily. So for me, a nice chorus sponge filter. So that's overkill. So these are all, you're setting up an ecosystem, and each ecosystem is different, right? Are there plants in there? How often do you change water? How heavily do you feed? What's your bio load in there? All that stuff, even temperature, has to come into account. But I would say if I'm looking at Gemco, let me do that real quick so I can give you a real answer and actually tell you a size. The Hydro Sponge filters, I usually get the Hydro Sponge 5 because I like them nice and big. But I think you could go easily probably with a Hydro Sponge 3, something like that, and be just fine. But it depends. If you don't want to change water but once every 6 months, maybe you get the bigger one. If you change water every week, Hydro Sponge 3 is fine. And how many fish do you have and how much food do you put in there? So how about other folks? What size do you guys use in a 20-gallon?
Well, for my 20 longs, I use the medium stubs, the ones that are stubby. For my longs, because otherwise the tube's just way too high.
Yeah, I cut the tube in half for the 20s.
Yeah, I'll do that sometimes too. If they just have larges, then I cut the tube so it's only an inch.
So how big around is the diameter of that one, Ed? Is that like a 4-inch?
I think it's 5.
It's the 5.
But it's only 2 inches tall.
Oh, the pancake. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
So that's what I use for my 20 longs. I don't know.
That's what I use as well.
Yeah, cool.
Awesome. Well, Dan, if there's one fish out there that you could get to sell, like, there's always one thing that you always have your eye on. Mm-hmm. Is there like that gold nugget fish that you're always looking for?
I would love to find a reliable supplier of blue galaris. That's a fish that the industry wants and the hobby wants and should have, but it's a supply and demand problem. almost all of the colorful killifish, the Aphyosemians, the Fundulopanchax, a lot of the Epiplates, but mostly Fundulopanchax and Aphyosemian genuses of killifish. I would love almost any of those if I could find a good supplier of those. There used to be a couple guys. There was a guy named Steve Butcher and his son Chris Butcher, who were breeding at a commercial level killifish. They would do several different kinds of Aphyosemians, Fundulopanchax, and Nothobronchius, which are those. The Nothobronchius are those really pretty annual killifish from Africa that are just stunning. And they did it for a few years. In fact, I would go to the wholesalers in Los Angeles and see tanks full of killies, and that's where they were coming from. But they haven't done that for a while. So that was the only time I'm aware of in my lifetime that there was someone really cranking them out at that level. I wish they were doing it again because I'd buy them all. But yeah.
Patrick Hardy's got a question. He wants to know if you're going to get any more rare live bears that can go into hard water.
Yes, I've actually been denying myself of buying humpback limias for a few weeks. I have a supplier that has them available, and I can't breed enough to keep up with demand. But I'm waiting for the warehouse, because in the warehouse I'll have an option for harder water. So once I get the harder water, then as long as it doesn't need cold temperatures, there's a lot of the Goodeids and things like that I won't be able to do, because the water temperature in the warehouse is going to be 76, 77 degrees, and that's just too hot for a lot of them. But others that can take that temperature, yeah, I would love to do that. I've just not been bringing in those the humpback limias that I could get right now, because I know they're coming from a really hard water source and my water is soft, and it actually takes a couple generations to fully acclimate those to soft water. So I with moving to the warehouse soon and all that, it just doesn't make sense to do that. But once I can, yeah.
Dan, if you had to pick, what is your go-to substrate that you would use in your tanks?
Bare bottom for me, unless the fish really benefits from sand, or some kind of substrate. So in my tanks, it's either bare bottom or a fine sand. I use fine sand for the cories. I use it for the plecos too. What I found is those fish that kind of like to graze all day long, if there's a fine layer of sand down there, then between feedings, they go in there and they find all kinds of stuff to eat, and it keeps them busy, and it just supplements their diet, because there's always algae and little microorganisms and stuff growing in that. So for the killies, for the gobies, not the killies, sorry, for the cories, for the gobies, geophagus, for example, things like that, Bolivian rams, just anything that really enjoys sifting through sand. Barbs really like it. Like, they're hungry all the time. So it's good for barbs. It's good for live bears. I just find to get better weight, and the fish seem to do better if they have sand. Now, a lot of fish, they could care less. And those fish I like to put in bare bottom tanks, but it's either bare bottom or fine sand for me.
Thank you.
There are still questions out there, but we've got 1 minute, and Kenny is coming up next. Can one of the mods post his link out there, please, so we can find our way over there? But quickly, Kyle, Aquarimetrics, wants to know, when you refer to clean water, does floating and settled detritus count as dirty, or are we just talking in terms of basic water parameters?
Yeah, but when I say clean water, I'm usually talking about parameters. Like, I have tanks that are really clean water, but they're green water. So people see them sometimes and they're like, oh, and I'm like, no, that's great. Like, I don't have many of those, and I usually take care of it so I can take video or pictures eventually. But I'm talking about the parameters. Now, you asked about molm or detritus. That depends. Is this like a pile of fresh fish poop? Get that out of there. Is this something that's decomposing rapidly? Get that out of there. There's all kinds of besides ammonia and other toxins that are released from the decomposition process, there's the microorganisms that are doing the decomposition process, and a lot of those are protozoans, and they won't be harmful until they have a nice fresh pile of food that they can dig into, and then their population explodes and they can actually make your fish very sick. So there's a lot of organisms in your tank that don't harm your fish normally unless you have a big bioactive pile of poo or a plant dying or a bunch of uneaten food or something. So if we're talking about stuff that's actively decomposing quickly, I would get that out of there. But if you're talking about something that is pretty much inert, is pretty much at the point of like peat moss by then, and isn't really rapidly decomposing, I don't think that's so bad. Some fish really like that and like nibbling on it, and it's good for fry. So it depends on your definition of detritus and mold. If it's more or less inert, no problem. If it's decomposing rapidly, I would get it out of there.
The Zen Ginger just posted a link to your video, shipping supplies and sources.
Oh, cheers.
And Chattanooga Ed did a super chat earlier for $5 that said, "Dan, you're the man," or something to that effect. I can't see it anymore.
Thanks, Ed.
All
Was it
right.
punching me in the face?
No, I thought about it. I didn't want you to do this on Bob's string.
All right, guys. Our time is up and over a little bit. Dan, we really, really appreciate you coming back and coming, and maybe we'll need to do a part 2 somewhere down the road. We'll see if that's something you'd be interested in, but you still have questions out there, so that at some point we have to stop. We really appreciate you and you sharing all of your knowledge with us, and I always learn something, so it's a real treat to have you, and appreciate it. And
Hey, I'm glad to be here anytime, Bob. Bob's, for those that don't know, Bob is an OG like customer and community builder for Dan's Fish. He's been around since the beginning. I'd be a lot farther back in my process, in my progression as a company, if it wasn't for Bob. And Bob and Thomas both mod for me. Ed's constantly punching me in the face with super chats. Like this is a tight community. So I appreciate you guys. I'm happy to come and help any way I can.
These are Dan's fish right here. Oh, can't do it.
Oh yeah, I sent you those and they were about 2 inches, right? Those
Yeah,
thread Finicara.
They're about that big, but this is a 200-gallon tank and they're way in the back.
We call that eating size.
Yeah.
thank you, moderators, and thank you, Ed, for the super chat, and thank you again, Dan. Thank you, members. And I guess we've done all we can do with this time, so thank you, everybody.
Thank you.